Let's go ahead and start with our friend Alan, and I'm gonna introduce Alan briefly through these slides. You might, if you've ever gone to the grocery store and purchased something like this, you have seen Alan Ariel's lettering. Alan has been a professional lettering artist for all of his life. He works on what I would consider to be a little tiny drawing table, but he's been working commercially since the 80s, I believe, and he'll clarify that at the end here. But this is the kind of stuff that he does. He's been hired by plenty of people, and so you've seen some or a lot of his lettering as you've gone through some of the grocery aisles and commercial in commercial applications. And one of the things that he used was this design art marker. Now, this design art marker, I used to have these. These were from the 80s. And when you take the cap off, some of you might remember, you actually take a whiff and kind of get high. So there's sort of these solvent-based markers, but they do a lot for somebody like Alan. And Alan got interested in calligraphy, and Alan lives in the Chicago area and close enough within striking distance to Reggie Ezel. Now, for those of you who don't know who Reggie Ezel is, Reggie is one of the foundational instructors. If you don't have a foundational instructor like I was fortunate enough to have, then Reggie is one of the people that you would take. And this is his work that is flipping in the background, where he's worked with glass and sculptural elements and all these different things. But he's really a fundamental teacher. So if you want to know gilding, if you want to know any basic historical hand or any structural historical hands, Reggie is one of the top in the world. He's been teaching for years, not only on weekends, but also at all the international conferences. So very well known. And Alan went to him and started asking him questions about calligraphy, the kind of calligraphy that we do, as opposed to the commercial lettering that he does. And as a result of some of those conversations, he got interested in sort of making pens and seeing what he could come up with different things. And you can see some influences here from either Coit pens or automatic pens, as well as the speedball pens. And he's kind of working with his pen holders in order to work with something that he can use. And he's a pretty interested guy. He's like, well, what if I want more ink? And what if I want more pen strokes out of a little pen like this? And so he's worked with all of these different iterations of trying to figure out how to make things work. And this is very familiar to me because in my studies of Ross George went through many of these same things, trying to figure out how ink flow would come and so on and so forth. So Alan continued, and the interesting part to me about this is that he worked with some bamboo and he worked with carving some pen tips, some traditional pen tips, but then he also began to work with pen holders. And you'll notice that these are pretty fat pen holders. And you'll remember in that picture that he worked with a pretty fat pen. That design art marker was a pretty fat pen. And so he's beginning to sort of work with all of these different shapes. He's working with broad edges and trying to figure out, wow, how if I make this, am I more comfortable with a skinny pen or a fat pen? And why are they all using skinny holders when I'm using fat holders? And so he began to really experiment not only with the pens, but the holders. And so you'll see he's now working with folded pens. I wonder what happens if I fold it this way. And I wonder what kind of marks I can get if I fold it that way. And Alan works pretty quickly as a commercial lettering artist. He tells me that he's on the phone sometimes with these art directors and they've got 10 minutes and he's got to make a presentation in 10 minutes. So a lot of his presentations are pretty rough, but they're very conceptual. You can see on the very left of this picture that here's the first kind of iteration of what's now the pens that he makes. It's sort of got a smaller shape as opposed to all these other folded pens. And then Heather, as I was telling you, he got kind of into turning pen holders and experimenting with all of these different elements on the lathes and created some really interesting pen holders. Again, more to the shape that he was used to and using those design art markers according to what I can see. And so you'll take a look and he kind of got back to, well, wait, I'm making all these pens, but I'm trying to figure out how I letter and what are the characteristics of this marker that I liked. And you come back to this tip of this marker, which is a sort of a cone shaped tip. And so he began to work with that little tip and these layered pieces of metal, and in a similar fashion to the design art marker. It's not exactly the same. You'll see the marker has some sort of, it's conical shaped and it's a little bit flatter, and he's working with some rounded things and working with some flex. And so this is how he begins to actually come up with what we know now as the EZA pen. Alan's very gestural anyway, and so he's working with the pen. What happens if I hold it flat? What happens if I hold it on its side? And what now can I take off, do takeoffs on this shape? And so he's got all these shapes that he's been, these monster shapes. Some of them are shaped a little bit more like a spade, for example. Some of them are a lot more round. Some of them are rounded on one side and flat on the other side. And so he's been working with these, and he's also working with fine tuning all of these. And so he'll take those tips and he'll say, okay, I need to knock off some of these rough edges that are going to catch on paper or catch on whatever I'm working on. And so he'll file them down according to his needs. And so he's, as you can probably tell by all these pictures, he's kind of focused. He kind of gets into the details of working with these pens. And so he's made many, many, many pens and many combinations of pens and holders. He's worked with smooth papers and rough papers. What happens if I want to get more of a ruling pen? And see, we're all used to working with ruling pens. We work with ruling pens more on their sides, more with that tip vertical. And so, well, what happens if I work with it more like a ruling pen in here? And he can get a lot of those splatters, but he can also get a lot of the smooth effects that he wants. And so you'll not only see that has precision instruments, that he's precision, that he's very detailed, but he's also pretty good at staging photos, isn't he? he's got everything going in different directions, and so this is his workshop, and this is where he kind of makes these pens and how he kind of makes everything. Around this time, Yves Leterme came to town, and he had heard about Yves, and so Yves was teaching a gestural lettering workshop, and so Alan, of course, brought his pens. And he started working with these pens sitting in the very back. And so Yves was walking around and he kind of looked at him weird and said, huh, that's interesting, and kept walking. And then his interest was piqued and he came back and Alan said, well, these are pens I made, and how about trying them? And so Yves, working with Alan's tool, all of a sudden saying, wow, I can really get used to this. And so there was a particular period of time when Yves initially was enamored of this pen, where you guys might have seen this on Facebook or Instagram, because he was really excited about this pen. And I don't know how many pens Yves has. Alan could probably tell me better, but he's probably got 15 or 20 of these. He loves them so much. And so as a result of that, I've talked to Alan a little bit, and he's kind of like me. He doesn't get a lot of work done in a workshop. I very rarely, I get a lot of conceptual things done in a workshop, but really nothing from the drawing table. But a little bit later after that workshop, and with some of those gestural techniques, Alan came and took those pens and created his own lettering. And so he's taken that pen and worked with it. And so as that evolution has happened, he's come to these pens. Now, these are my sort of pride and joy pens. And I wanted to work with some of these different tips. And in talking to Alan and preparing for this, I asked him if he would be willing to film something, because I wanted to really see not only how he used these, but what his pace was. And I'll give you some caveats. You're going to see Alan working with this pen, but Alan's working with these pens now on a flat surface, where he's usually used to working on a very slanted surface. But take a look as he puts the pen down. He's not using it like we use a ruling pen. He's using it more flat. And then when he wants a thicker stroke, he'll press down. So there's a little bit of pressure working with these pens. And so he can get really, really thicks and thins. And if he wants to get splatters, he'll just turn it on the side. And so this is some of the lettering he's doing. Now, again, he's working on a flat surface because at his drawing table, the light was terrible. And I wanted him to send me some stuff. And so he went into his workshop. And so he's not quite as natural as he is, but obviously you can tell this guy's a pro. And so he's working with this. Let me just fast forward this a little bit. He's working with thicks and thins and working with how this pen will make his marks. And you can see as he turns the pen back and forth, depending on which direction he wants. And he'll work with pen pressure. What he's writing about is there happens to be a blue jay that appears at his window every morning. And so he gives him a peanut. And so he's talking about Mr. Blue Jay who wants a peanut, which I think this just happened a couple days ago. And this is that lettering after he's taken it and smoothed it out just a little bit. It doesn't look to me like he's done, and he'll comment on this, like he's done a lot of retouching on this, but it's a little bit smoother maybe than some of the things that we've seen. But let me give you an idea of where he's retouched it. You can take a look at that B in Mr. Bluebird, and you see those kind of 3 lines. He's come back in as a commercial lettering artist, and let me tell you a little bit about his background as a commercial lettering artist. I told you that sometimes he has 10 or 15 minutes on the phone with somebody, and so this is a recent conversation that he had with the designers at Folgers, and he was talking about this work, and he had just a little bit of time on the phone or on Zoom or whatever he was on in order to show these guys what he was talking about. And so this is some of the work that he did. And then I'll end with my favorite. This is using those pens, and then he's put this back into to retouch it. And I'm not sure how well this is showing up. I think it's showing up pretty well, but take a look at the middle of the E in evolution. And you'll see some very, very fine lines that he's sort of cross-hatched in there, as well as the bottom of the L. And so he's taken the elements of this really spontaneous and easy flowing lettering, and then created something that's much more attractive with it, because of his skill. He doesn't have to paste stuff up anymore, and he doesn't have to draw anything by hand necessarily, even though he might. But he's doing a lot of this in Photoshop. So, and I'm assuming you're unmuted. Doesn't look like you're muted. And so I would love to, if you have any comments to make on the presentation I made and all the mistakes I made and lies I told.
No, everything's there. I think the point with the pens and with me personally is I've always had to write a few words in a very quick manner, that is commercial lettering. And when I started seeing people in the CCC and calligraphers doing this just gorgeous work that was on a bigger scale, that's when I contacted Reggie. And, for me to sit down and do a large composition, I don't think I have the mindset to that, because everything I've done is very fast. So the tool that I started working on had to be something where my hand could move very fast. And it's similar to a marker. And as I progressed with it, I was able to tweak the metal in a way with different layers where it responds like a brush, like a pointed brush. So that's where I'm at. I've got 5 different tips that evolved from practically thousands of tips. And we're talking about maybe 10 years of working on pens to get to the point where it is right now. And no matter what, I could use a traditional pointed nib and an oblique, and I could do gorgeous, gorgeous lettering. But the problem is I cannot move it in the same fashion that I can with the Easy 8 pens. So there's something about stainless steel coming together at a point where it creates pressure, it has some flexibility. It's as if it's almost got suspension to handle movements I could push and pull, which aren't normal movements. So that is very similar to a marker. There's no restrictions in a marker. And that's basically where I'm at with the pens. And, like any tool, every tool has its own pros and cons. But for me, when I have to do something fast or get an idea down very quick, I'll grab that pen and I'll put it down. I might do a skeleton line first, and then I go over it with the pen. And I never know what those shapes are going to be. That's what's similar to a brush. I never know, like evolution, I can never imagine anything like that. So by twisting and turning the tip, using certain pressure, using a certain amount of side edge, I could really do a variety of thicks, thins, whatever, to just make something interesting, something that doesn't exist. And most probably everything that I'll end up doing for the remainder of the time I'm on the planet is just short words or short 3 or 4 words or whatever it is, because that was what I became the norm for me with commercial lettering. So even a piece like Evolution, that took many hours to redraw in Adobe Illustrator, but yet I had everything there from the quick pen sketch or whatever it was. So that's basically the pens. And then I was fortunate to contact Yves, to be in contact with him. And when he started showing the pens, I didn't have the technical skill to make pens on the volume that I got contacted about. So it's taken about 4 years from that point to understand how to actually make something. And I just updated the website that has like a basic pen, and it's simplified. And I think it's more direct as to what the pens are, because it's very confusing when you start selling things and switching tips, and it's a bit of a disaster in a way. So what's on the website now is very direct as to what the pens do. And I have examples showing different techniques that happen with them. And that's, it's like, it's a different kind of tool. It's not a tool that you would want to use if you're a pointed pen master trying to do a traditional hand. But if you're looking for something where you can shift characters or weights in a very fast manner, it's a good tool for that point.
Well, and I think the interesting part for me, and by the way, this is Alan's website that you're seeing over here. It's EZA. Is it EZA.com?
It's EZApens.com.
EZApens.com. And he's just working on it. Alan says that he's for the rest of his life going to be working on these pens. I think he's going to be for a good part of his rest of his life working on that website and trying to figure out video from our conversations. He picked up video pretty quick. So, but I thought the interesting part wasn't really about the production of the pens, although that's an interesting part. You had problems to solve and you had to figure that out. But it was more about the formation of that pen, as opposed to many of us. There's many manufacturers that have taken a look at, for example, the automatic pen shape and said, oh, I'm going to make my own, or the ruling pen shape, or the folded pen shape. But they've all taken something that calligraphers already use and tweaked it. Or holders, for example, the pen holders that Heather makes for pointed pens, or that Jake Weidman makes, these really weird ergonomic, amazing pen holders. They're there for an application, but you did something a little bit different. You took something that you'd already used and said, I wonder if I could make a metal pen out of this shape. And that's, to me, that's just a little bit different. And we have some limited time, and so I just wanted to open it up. If there's any quick questions, I'm going to make sure that Alan stays. This poor guy, he's going to have to stay till the end of the presentation, and you'll be able to ask him questions. But is there anybody who has maybe a quick question that he could answer? I don't see any.
This is Dodie.
Hi, Dodie.
Hi. I have a question about the tips. There is some confusion, and you're not doing this anymore. You did make the pen where they could have interchangeable tips.
Oh, right. They're all like that now. What happened is when I updated the website, I did some pens that took less time to produce, and those have the tips epoxied into them. And the
and take a look at these.
Right, there's a
pictures.
pen on there that it comes with tips. And what happened is when I started selling people a lot of pens, I was concerned to just send them a flex tip, because I thought maybe they might use too much hand pressure and bend the metal too much. So I would include a stiffer tip with that. And I just reached a conclusion when somebody buys a pen on that level, I'm going to give them 2 tips because it's good to have an option to use a light touch or something where you may need a heavy hand. And that way it really covers a variety of different stroke patterns you may try or pressure effects. So right now the pens have interchangeable tips. You could buy extra tips, and there's pens that are just very simple with the tip glued into the pen body. And there's one tip that's very durable. I have no concerns about it failing, and that's also epoxied into the wooden pen handle. So, you know, I think they're pretty good for the price ratios that they're listed at on the website. And
what are your price ratios, by the way?
The entry level one is 40, but then there's a pen that's 75 that comes with 2 tips. And then when you start getting into the real fancy pen bodies, it's like 85 for 1 tip.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the tip selections. There's 5 different tips.
Like, here's a
And they'll
beautiful
cover-
one. This has the little,
That's 11 I do.
yeah,
Right.
this has a beautiful, you know, anyway. Okay. I'll ask you to hold your questions, and Alan, thank you so much for
Oh, sure.
answering
My
these
pleasure.
questions. And I'm gonna go ahead and move on here because we have a little bit more to go.